Welcome back to the Oscars recap episode, part 2 of 3. Here we're going to continue our discussion. Let's skip the intro music and get right to the discussion. I think another movie that's worth talking about, it did not get the flowers that All Is Quiet on the Western Front got, but it's nominated everywhere, and I'm going to get in trouble for not pronouncing it correctly, but
it's the Banshees of Insherin.
Is a D in it?
INISHERIN.
Yeah, see, the Banshees of Insherin.
INISHERIN. See, I'm not Irish, so I can't. So I'll preface this before I talk about the film by saying I watched the Banshees, All Is Quiet on the Western Front, and Everything Everywhere All at Once in a 2-day period. So I'm processing all these things at the same time, and I have to say that watching the Banshees, that is a film that I thoroughly enjoyed.
And it's a movie that I think a lot of people will enjoy, but they'll be surprised. If you watch the trailer of Banshees of Insherin, I don't think you immediately say, "Oh, I want to watch that."
Yeah, it's not something that's just
I have to see that.
Pop off the top of the head, unless you're a fan of Colin Farrell, you're a fan of the director, and you're like, "Oh, I've just got to see their film." It is a simple concept that is beautifully acted and carried out throughout the film that I think anybody can relate to, and that is the idea of a breakup.
Yep, and this movie is constantly going between these very simple ideas matched with very complex ideas, and it's as close as I've ever seen, I think, to watching a book. There's lots of movies that were based off of books, but this felt like I was reading a book with the metaphors, with the imagery. The story is quite simply this. Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson portray Padraig and Colum, two lifelong pals on the remote island of INISHERIN, who find themselves at odds when Colum decides, seemingly out of nowhere, that they're no longer friends anymore.
Yes, they waste no time in establishing the central conflict.
And it's brought to the edge of really tragic absurdity as Colum threatens to snip off his fingers until Padraig will leave him alone. And the reality is that Colum is facing a later life crisis. And while Padraig is a simple man, Colum is a talented fiddle player. He enjoys the arts, and he truly yearns to leave a legacy after his death. So after Colum very abruptly abandons Padraig, we meet Dominic, the slow-speaking, slow-thinking other friend. And he might be as bland as unseasoned oatmeal, but he's a good-natured kid, and he's got ambitions all of his own, which only makes it worse when we discover that his dad, the town police officer, Peter, is physically and emotionally abusing Dominic. So Padraig and his sister Siobhan take Dominic in, and throughout the movie, we really lean on the relationship between Padraig and his sister Siobhan. And if Padraig is dull and Dominic is daft, Siobhan is anything but. However, to the rest of the town, she's revered as somewhat of a bit of an oddity. Very much like Belle in Beauty and the Beast, Siobhan reads books. She takes care of her family. She keeps to herself, which is rare in this small farming. So throughout the movie, Siobhan and Dominic really play mediator, and they attempt to diffuse the feud between Colum and Padraig. However, all of their efforts prove to be useless because tensions build and build and build until they finally reach a boiling point between Padraig and Colum, to which Colum responds by finally cutting off one of his fingers, and he throws it at Padraig's door. And it's the local elder, Miss McCormick, who warns Padraig that death will come to the island soon, and it will come in twos. So Padraig visits Colum to confront him, and Colum reveals that he's finished composing his song that he's been working on to leave after his death, which he calls the Banshees of Insherin. The two appear to be on the point of reconciliation. When Padraig leaves, Colum cuts off all 4 of his remaining left fingers, and he throws them at Padraig's door. And by the end of the film, he hasn't got any fingers left to play the instrument that he loved, and damning him to an eternity of irrelevance, even to the man that once revered him like a brother, Padraig. Meanwhile, Siobhan receives a job offer to work at a library on the mainland, which would take her away from the island, and she has to mull whether or not to take it and leave her brother alone. And when she's thinking about this, she gets harassed by Peter, the police officer, and Dominic's father, where he says some really nasty things to her that no one likes you here on the island. And so she retreats to a nearby lake to kind of collect herself and deal with her emotions. And it's there Dominic asks her on a date, and she kindly refuses. She goes to the pub to tell Padraig that she's made the decision that she's going to accept the job and she will be leaving. And Padraig, broken from the loss of his beloved sister, stands on the edge of this cliff just waving to her sailboat as she sails away. He returns home, and when he gets there, he finds that his pet donkey, Jenny, has choked on the fingers that Colum had pelted at his door. On the other side of the island, Dominic is found dead, and Padraig decides to avenge Jenny's death by burning Colum's house down. And in the closing shots of the film, Colum and Padraig, with Colum's smoldering house in the background, and declaring, they both say, that this civil war will never be over. So, yeah, there's not actually any banshees in this movie. It's just a metaphor for the death of a relationship, right? Well, here's the thing, though. There's this one character, Miss McCormick, who floats in the background of the story, unbeknownst to them. And at the very end of the movie, Miss McCormick is observing them from a distance of the burnt cottage fade to black.
Set to the backdrop of the Irish Civil War. So we have this little island, almost civil war between two friends, mirroring the Irish Civil War. It's a very simple concept that I think a lot of people can relate to, because we've all been that kid on the playground. We've all been that kid where it's like, I don't want to be your friend anymore. But it's interesting to see it from an adult perspective, because usually I think in those situations, there's some sort of incident that arises that causes this friction between two people, and it's established within the first two scenes of the movie that there was no reason for him not wanting to be his friend. He just doesn't want to be his friend anymore because he kind of finds him a little dull or boring. Colin Farrell's character is constantly trying to figure out what did he do to cause this rift with Colum.
And this is where the writing is done so well. You as the audience, you go on the journey where you jump back and forth between sides. You're like, yep, I understand this character's motivation. I understand this character's motivation. So Barry O'Keegan gives an excellent performance where Dominic's character could be very easily just comic fodder or comic relief. But the way that Barry Keoghan performs, it turns Dominic into like this really awesome character.
Endearing. You're endearing to his situation.
I totally understand why he was nominated. I would not give him a win at all for the award, but I totally see why he was nominated.
And Siobhan, she acts this role beautifully, because as they're having this tussle, Colum is explaining to her, because she's trying to be the intermediary between Padraig and Colum, to why they can go all of a sudden from being best friends to now he doesn't want to be his friend anymore. And Padraig, he's really struggling with this emotionally. It's really beating him up. And so Colum tells her, he's just dull. And she lets Colum know, you're all dull. Like it's a small island. Nobody here is special. You're all dull. None of you have anything.
All of you go to the bar at 2:00.
Yeah,
you're
every
all the
single
same
day.
dude.
Yeah. There's nothing special about any of you. You shouldn't be mean to my brother just because you think he's dull. Like, you're dull yourself. And that line where she tells him it's actually the 18th century, he's not as cultured as he thinks he is. Mm-hmm. And so you get the idea, but you also understand why Colum wouldn't want to talk about boring stuff. If he's got 12 years to live on this island and he's trying to create something, he doesn't want to spend 2 hours of it every day talking about donkey poop or whatever.
Well, that's the interesting part, is for a lot of the film, you spend really rooting for Padraig. Like, yeah, why are you being such a jerk to our buddy? But it's also, when you start to look at the motivations from Colum, you start to really understand we've all been in the place where we were disappointed with maybe where our life had taken us. I can imagine sitting in a small village town where you're seeing the excitements of a civil war across the bay, but you're not close enough to touch it. You thought your whole life was going to be this, and it's not that. There's no real prospects for marriage. There's no prospects of having children at this age. All the things you thought your life was going to be when you were 15, it's not that.
The legacy devices.
The legacy is not there. And so I can understand that. And Siobhan is kind of the voice of the audience of like, well, why can't you just make time for him? Like, why don't you just talk to him for 15 minutes? You're talking to everybody else in this movie. Why are you picking on Padraig? I think the reason he picks on Padraig specifically to cut this friendship is almost like a blaming device. This self-mutilation comes from a place of despair, almost like a midlife crisis of being able to say, I'm not able to do what I want to do. I can't make music anymore. I can't paint anymore. I can't make these contributions I was going to make anymore because of Padraig. And I think that's very metaphorical of other people blaming other people for their own problems.
Yeah, we all know somebody that's they blame the world for everything that's happened to them without taking some responsibility for
that's
why
not
they're
to
in that
say that
situation.
like the circumstances they were put in their life weren't like unfair or challenging. You know, you know people that have said, well, if I didn't meet that person and have that child, or if my sibling could get their head out of their butt and I didn't have to support, if my parents were financially independent, I wouldn't have to support them. If I didn't have to give money to these people, it would be better. But then at the end of the day, you have to be accountable to your life. And I think that Colum is wrestling with that. And as the movie goes on, he has no more fingers on one of his hands. He cannot play music. The thing he set out to do, he can't accomplish anymore because of his own choices, not because of Padraig's.
Well, so you have this island, which is the backdrop for the movie, but you quickly realize it's limited in people. There's limited things for them to talk about. Most of the people on the island kind of are regretful of their situation. They're in everybody else's business. They don't really have anything going on for themselves. And you have Padraig, who's a nice guy because he's one of the few people that's actually super satisfied with the situation that he's in, and he's happy. And that's why, as the film starts out, you're on Padraig's side, but as it goes along, you realize that he's just very selfish. He wants everything to stay the way that it is because it's comfortable for him, and he lives in that comfort. And so when Dominic is telling him, like, you were the nice guy, like you were the one that was happy with this situation. Now you're just like everybody else who's bitter on the island, who's upset with the situation that they find themselves in. And Padraig's like, no, I'm still a nice guy, which nice guy is used in this situation like whenever anybody who's ever tried to set somebody up on a blind date and they ask if the other person's attractive and they go, well, they're nice. So it's like it's used as a placeholder because he's called dull or kind of simple, and so people are, no, you're just a nice guy, like you're not an idiot. And there's a line where he's talking with his sister, and he's like, am I the dullest person on the island? And she's like, no, it's Dominic by miles and miles. He's like, well, who's the next dullest? And she's like, I'm not gonna
talk about this.
Yeah, she's like, we can't talk about this anymore.
And it brings up a really interesting point. So Dominic, the village idiot, and in a moment of vulnerability from her, he very cutely asks her on a date. And after like fumbling through the ask, there's a moment where you're like, wow, she's really hurting because her whole life, no one respects her, no one sees her, and now she feels wanted.
And Dominic's father just told her that everybody hates her.
It's this really pretty moment. And you think like, wow, she's going to go on a date with Dominic. That's why I did not expect that. But she wisely is like, no, I can't do that. And she puts him down gently, and the rejection that Barry Keoghan plays off as actiness is like this. I think that scene is why he got nominated.
Oh yes,
that is the scene where he gets nominated for, where it's like, but in this moment you also see Shaban decide, I have to leave the island. No one respects me. The only person that respects me is the guy that's miles and miles behind everybody else.
Yeah, the village idiot is
if
my
the
only
village idiot
prospect.
is the only one that courts me, I will be stupid not to take this opportunity. So she kind of resolves that she's going to take this opportunity. So very quickly, Padraig is going to go from having a community that he was happy with to living in a place where he doesn't really have any allies. He doesn't have any friends. And he's no longer the guy that's happy here. He's just here. The tragedy of this movie is Jenny the donkey. And this is the moment that he cannot take it anymore. Padraig has lost his sister. He has lost his best friend in Colum. He has lost his new friend in Dominic. There is nothing else for him. So he resolves, I'm going to do something terrible to him.
And it's a start of, it's when he truly engages in their civil war, and he results to an extreme decision, just like Colum has already resulted to by cutting off his fingers. Now he's going to burn down Colum's house. And Brett, you brought this up to me, which is something that I didn't realize. They talk about Banshees. Banshee is the song that that Colum wrote on his violin, and
Mm-hmm.
Colin Farrell's character Podrick is quick to point out that there's no banshees on the island, and Colum lets him know, well, I think they're here. They're just kind of observing and smiling with what's going on. And there's a older figure on the island, Miss McCormick, who is kind of creepy, but you really only get an interaction between her and the brother and sister and the police officer and the village idiot. So it doesn't seem like everybody really sees this character. And as Brett pointed out to me previously, these banshees, these ghouls, these ghosts are common threads in like Shakespeare and in plays. And so whenever the really chaotic events start to happen, whenever life's unraveling, Miss McCormick's always there, and she's just laughing and creeping out everybody. But she's letting them know like something unfortunate is about to happen, and that she's finding joy in these people's sorrow on the island.
And so right before, I've got to assume that there's a lot of like metaphors and allegories here for the Irish Civil War. I'm not privy to that information, but I do know that when you look at some of the weird beats in this story arc, these are two brothers. They're still Irish. They're still friends. And even though they're being ripped apart, they still at some place care for each other.
At their core.
When you talk about the weird escalation of like, I don't want to be your friend anymore, I'm going to cut off all my fingers. That feels like the weird thing in war of like, the only way I can do this is if we bomb a school, if we bomb a hospital. That's the only way we can get like, no, you can get your point across through talking.
Yeah,
there's many other things that we can do besides that. And so I think that there's very obviously some things here, but for me as a movie, this hit me in so many ways. Really, this reminds me a lot of one of the movies you and I have talked a lot about, of Hell or High Water, another former Oscar-nominated film. I think it was back in 2015. It perfectly demonstrates a realistic look at what it's like to grow up in rural Texas. You know, it is so authentic and accurate. This movie feels so authentic and accurate. I'd love to talk to somebody that has some ties to Irish culture to say, like, how accurate is this? What are the other themes that tie directly to that? Because this film hurts. You're with all the buddies. You're with all the people. You understand the motivations and the challenges, and you know the decisions they need to make, but it hurts when they make them. The way they use colors, the way they use different types of metaphors of the looking glass, and there's so much reflection going on in this movie where characters are looking through glass, and they're reflecting on this moment where we as the audience are taught, think about what's going on, think deeply, and it hurts when you think deeply. Over and over and over again, it's still a really funny movie.
Oh,
like for a period piece, this makes me laugh.
I laughed so hard.
This is not like Downton Abbey or some other kind of like Irish-British show where it's very daft. This makes you laugh. There's a lot of funny, humor between friends.
It's a dry humor, but there's a lot of dark, funny jokes that just instantly will make you laugh out loud.
I watched this movie specifically because I knew the premise was one day this guy just decides, I don't want to be your friend anymore. Well, I had a really great friend through college. And I'm certain there is someone that'll listen to this podcast and they'll know who I'm talking about. Because I know a friend of mine from college actually listened to the podcast. They'll listen to this and they'll know who I'm talking about. But he was my roommate in college. I hung out with him every day. We were 2 peas in a far out pod. We were Shaggy and Scooby, peanut butter and jelly, whatever you want to call it. He was in my wedding. He was a brother to me. One day, I went over to his house to go to his birthday party. I texted him, I'm here, and I never heard from him again. It is like he died. I did not get the experience that Podrick and Colum had of being able to fight for this relationship. Now, I told you, that was when I had no children. I was married. So 7-ish years ago. And I still text him. I still reach out to him. And radio silence. So for me watching this movie, I was hoping to find something. Hoping to get some sort of happy ending. Of oh, they're going to get better. And maybe that'll just be a microcosm for me to get something out of it. And it wasn't. It hurt watching a friendship fall apart. And this wasn't like a friend of like, oh, just some guy I knew, or this is someone that I lived life with. It was a really tough pill to swallow. And so I felt Podrick's pain. And I thought that Colin Farrell absolutely deserved a nomination for Best Actor. I did not think he should win. On that talk, though, of like awards, I really thought that the actress that played Siobhan, I think that's the best female supporting actress.
Yeah,
that's
her
to me is who I would have voted for. I know that Angela Bassett carried Black Panther. She's truly the lead of that film. And I know that I really like Jamie Lee Curtis in Everything Everywhere All at Once. She was fantastic.
Yeah,
Those
I don't
are
have a
great
problem with her
performances.
winning it.
It just, in my opinion, I thought that the layers, maturity, depth, humor, and drama that Siobhan had, it really brought a whole added element of color to this movie. And when you think about life, when you think about the breakup movies that you think of, there are so many movies like The Breakup with Vince Vaughn and Jennifer Aniston where it's funny, it's drawn out.
We
Hollywood
have a lot
tropes.
of relationship breakups as far as couples.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a lot of platonic friendship breakup movies.
Or if you see it in a movie, it's explored as like a petty thing. Like, oh, here's Regina. Yeah. She's got her burn book. Let's exploit that she doesn't like people. It's a very petty relationship. But here, what Colin wants to decide is not a bad thing. It's just how he goes about doing it. And I think it's kind of a cautionary tale of sometimes you can do the right thing, but you can do it so poorly that it has a devastating result. At the end of this movie, I'm left hopeful that something good can come out of it. But I also know the escalations of a civil war. But more carnage will come.
The thing that this movie does brilliantly is it's not an overly complicated formula, but it allows its actors to portray the characters with such depth, and it kind of just like sets them free in the dialogue. And so it's something that I think a lot of people can relate to because you get emotions that at one point you felt like each of the leading characters in your own life. And even though they take the emotions and the reactions to an extreme, which makes it more fun to watch in a film, it's still a pretty simple premise that is executed beautifully. And so in my opinion, I'd give this a 9.5 minivan. So I do think it is a 0.5 better than All Is Quiet on the Western Front. Personally, it is a movie that I will watch again and I will enjoy and I will laugh and I will likely cry a little bit. So
I think this is the first time we've agreed on a rating.
What?
I should honk. I'm gonna put a honk and post
beep, beep.
like. I ranked this 9.5. I mentioned the very personal connection. I did weep a couple times in this movie, just thinking of myself, thinking of the circumstances that me and my friend don't have anymore. Jeremy was my brother, and watching this movie, I went through all the emotions over again. And I thought about how my wife did her best, Siobhan, to protect me. And she was angry for me. She was sad for me. She was sometimes happy for me. Like, look, you don't need that in your life. But I was like Podrick, fighting for this friendship. I want this relationship. And it didn't happen. And like you said, this movie goes through the beautiful, simple story of it's just two friends stopping being friends. It doesn't try to be too much. There's not all this backstory or epilogue or exposition. You just experience it. But at the same time, it's ridiculous. There's witches and there's fingers being cut off. It's wild, but it's immediately raw. It is very, very real. And for a period piece to feel so tangible and real, I think that is just incredibly successful. When I found out this was nominated, I was just stoked because these are the types of films I think period pieces should be. They should be ones that are intensely personal. They should be really relatable, but they should also be incredibly accurate. I felt like I could smell that place.
Oh, yes.
I could see it. It was beautifully stunning. You could tell that it was shot on site somewhere. I have to imagine that Irish people that watch this movie are so proud of how accurate it is. I felt like I knew this village. I knew what these people were about. It was just accurate.
And there's not a lot of parallels between this film and All Is Quiet on the Western Front, but something that both of those films do excellently is that the environment, the backdrop for the film is a character that is utilized, and it's utilized beautifully. And it's something that I really appreciated. And I think that, like you said, the period pieces of both these films allow you to connect to them, even though emotionally it's two completely different types of emotions that it's pulling out of you. It allows for the maximum experience within itself.
See, and I think that's a little bit where it differentiates. Whereas All Is Quiet on the Western Front, they're trying to emote several feelings from you, and they give you enough narrative to follow. Here on the other side, the narrative isn't really big, but they give you characters and motivations. It's a totally different approach to movie making, but it's hella effective because relationships matter, people matter. And in this movie, we are introduced to several people in Padraig, Colum, Dominic, Siobhan, so many other people in the town. Like the old adage of, it's nice to be important, but it's important to be nice. And at the core of this movie, I think that's what we're talking about is, all in all, this movie really touched my heart. I hope that there are people that watch this movie and they find some deep connection to it as well, because it's beautiful. It deserves to get its flowers. I was hoping that it would just get one Oscar. Just give me one just to validate it. Again, these awards don't validate the movies, but you do want them to get some flowers, and this movie it hit me in the heart.
I couldn't have said it any better myself. What the Oscars mean, the importance or unimportance of awards. I think you bring up a good point, is like the movie doesn't need the validation of an Oscar, but we kind of want that personal validation of, I really like this. And for me, that's what the Oscars is. When I really like a movie and it's nominated and I want it to win, it's because I want to feel like I'm right about my opinion on the movie. And so I feel like if it gets that award, then that justifies my opinion. And if it doesn't win the award, then that means that, the Oscars don't really matter anyways. So
yeah. I think that's probably a good transition to our last movie that we want to talk about. And it's the only one that we hadn't seen prior to the Oscars. Hey, Rody, take a quick pit stop and grab a snack as we conclude our discussion on the Oscars recap in part 3.